Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Joanne Starks of SEDL in Austin, Texas, and I will be moderating today's webinar entitled Combining Quantitative and Qualitative Evidence in Systematic Reviews, Why, How, and When. It is the final presentation in a series of 4 webinars that make up an online workshop on Qualitative Research Synthesis. I want to thank my colleague Ann Williams for her logistical and technical support for today's session. The webinar is offered through the Center on Knowledge Translation for Disability and Rehabilitation Research, KTDRR, which is funded by the National Institute on Disability and Rehabilitation Research. The Center on KTDRR is sponsoring a community of practice on evidence for disability and rehabilitation, or DNR, research. Evidence in the field of disability and rehabilitation often includes studies that follow a variety of qualitative research paradigms. Such evidence is difficult to summarize using traditional systematic research review procedures. The goal of this series of web-based workshops is to introduce DNR researchers to the methodology of qualitative evidence reviews. Participants will be provided a state-of-the-art overview on current approaches and will learn to apply those to the literature base. Ongoing innovative initiatives at review-producing institutions will be highlighted. Today, our speaker is Dr. James Thomas, Associate Director of the EPPI-Centre and Professor of Social Research and Policy, University College London. His research interests include systematic reviewing, methods for research synthesis and research more broadly, the use of new information technologies in social research, evidence-informed policy and practice, and health promotion and public health. He specializes in developing methods for research synthesis, in particular for qualitative and mixed methods reviews, and in using emerging information technologies such as text mining in research. He leads a module on synthesis and critical appraisal on the EPPI-Centre's Master's Program in Research for Public Policy and Practice, and development on the Center's in-house reviewing software, EPPI Reviewer. Welcome, James, and thank you for agreeing to conduct this session today on combining quantitative and qualitative evidence. If you're ready, please go ahead.
Thank you, Joanne, and thank you for asking me to join you in this webinar. Okay. I'll move on to my first slide. I'm going to talk about combining qualitative and quantitative evidence. So it's rounding off this series on qualitative synthesis and synthesizing qualitative research, and thinking about how we can use qualitative research with other types of research and what useful function those kinds of reviews can play. So I'm going to talk through some of the whys why we might want to do this. Why should we integrate these different types of literature in a systematic review? And I'm going to talk about the policy context, which is what I know, and that will help us locate what we're trying to do with these reviews in a sort of a practical situation. I'm then going to talk a little bit about the mixed methods literature on primary research and how that relates to systematic reviews, because there's a temptation in the systematic review community to think that we're sort of inventing methods from scratch. And actually there's a lot going on in primary research that we can learn from. And then I'm going to talk through one example in particular of one type of mixed methods synthesis, and then refer you to some other sorts of research synthesis using mixed methods, which you might want to pick up in later reading. So first of all, thinking about what the problem is here. What's the problem that doing a mixed method synthesis might solve? And the context that I'm thinking about, the context I work in, is one of the things that it's important to bear in mind when engaged in this type of work is that research is only one small factor in the range of influences that go into policy development. So we've got all of these different factors here. We've got professional experience and expertise, we've got political judgments, we've got resources, values, habits, tradition, pragmatics, and lobbyists and pressure groups. And research evidence is sometimes this little outside voice here trying to get a voice at the table. So what we've been trying to do is to promote the use of research and get it heard in this quite noisy environment of policy making. So Ian Chalmers, who's one of the pioneers in this area, has written a number of papers on this. This one's a particularly interesting one because it sets the scene very well. And he reminds us that policymakers and practitioners who intervene in the lives of other people, even for well-intentioned purposes, not infrequently do more harm than good. And one of the examples that he talks about in that paper is that of Benjamin Spock's book Baby and Childcare, which my parents had when I was a baby. So this is one of the sort of single largest best-selling books of sort of 40 or so years ago, 50 years ago, and it's sold over 50 million copies, and it has well-intentioned advice in it that it's preferable to accustom a baby to sleep on its stomach from the start if he is willing. And this was fairly reasoned advice from Dr. Spock, but it wasn't actually based on any evidence. This was simply advice based on what seemed to be a good idea. However, we now know that that's positively harmful evidence that actually the risk of cot death is reduced if babies are not put on their tummy to sleep. So there was then a campaign in the 80s and then into the 90s which has dramatically reduced the incidence of sudden infant death. And this is really an example of a well-intentioned intervention, if you like, in that book, which actually did more harm than good. And once you've got some policy and some intervention based on evidence, that actually we get a little bit more good than harm. So that's the message that Ian Chalmers is portraying in that paper, and it's well worth reading. Allied to that is this move in medicine towards what is called evidence-based medicine, which sometimes sounds more certain and more based, if you like, on evidence than it actually is. David Sackett and colleagues have written this very widely cited paper, which aims to say what evidence-based medicine is and what it isn't. And they describe it very succinctly as the conscientious, explicit and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions. And so it's not necessarily expecting that you can read off the answer to a given problem from the research, but it's about making use of that evidence and the current best evidence in order to make decisions. So the question then is, of course, well, how do we do that? And this slide here illustrates what happens in an internet minute. The growth of information on the internet, let alone anywhere else, is staggering. And we're all suffering in a way from this deluge of data. How can we make sense of so much data? There's just so much of it. And so this is where systematic reviews themselves come in. And in the words of Ben Goldacre, in his Bad Pharma book, he describes systematic reviews as being distinct from simply looking at the research literature in a sort of like a traditional literature review sense. So instead of just mooching through the research literature, but basically picking out papers here and there that support our pre-existing beliefs or simply the ones that happen to be sitting there in our filing cabinet, we take a scientific and a systematic approach to the very process of looking for scientific evidence and ensuring that our evidence is as complete and representative as possible of all the research that has ever been done. So that's systematic reviews. And he's speaking mainly from a fairly clinical standpoint. Now, when we have been looking at translating that kind of a model of identifying and synthesizing the evidence base for use in public health policy, we found it very challenging. And there are three main reasons for this. Things are more complex in public health. We find that the context is complex. The questions that policymakers ask us are complex. And the data themselves are complex. I'll talk a little bit about each of those now. So to begin with, when we're thinking about the context of interventions, the context of intervening in public health, there are two aspects of this. There's what I call complicated complex, and there's complex complex. Sorry about all of these. So the Medical Research Council in the UK has defined what a complex intervention looks like. And it's basically something with several interacting components, and many of the problems of analysis, etc., relate to being able to standardize, but also to identify which are the most important components of a multi-component intervention. That's one idea of what complex is. It's a multi-component intervention, and it's difficult to standardize. However, some would say that that is just a complicated issue, really. That's not genuinely complex. And so there's a whole literature on complexity, which is much more around conceptualizing interventions as dynamic processes which operate in difficult to predict ways. They, for example, may have virtuous circles and feedback loops within their causal chains. And they also may have nonlinear step changes. So you might think that an intervention with one dose might not do very much, a little bit more, it might not do very much. But that the response to a particular amount of intervention might be expected to increase as the amount of intervention increases. But actually, some of the ideas around complexity are that you get nonlinear step changes. So what happens is you keep increasing the quantity or the intensity of an intervention, and you don't see any particular result until suddenly you reach a particular threshold, and then suddenly other things kick in and things start to happen. And this is all very well to sort of think about in abstract, but actually then thinking about how you might model that statistically is really quite a challenge. And then finally, there are what you might think of as multiple routes to effectiveness. So, for example, you might be looking at whether or not you need to train, for example, the people who are delivering the intervention. And so some studies may well report results that are better if you've trained the people who are delivering the intervention, and that's fine, and you can detect that statistically, so long as the ones which don't train their intervention providers do worse. But sometimes you get the situation where actually what's going on in the interventions is more complicated than that, where you may train the intervention providers in some situations and it makes a difference, and in others you may not train them. Maybe you've just recruited more authoritative, more experienced providers, and so they don't need training. But unless you've got that level of detail and that level of understanding about what's going on, you can't actually detect that in a synthesis, in a systematic review. So there are many levels in which looking at what's going on in the environment on the ground is more complex in public health. In addition, we find that policymakers just ask us pretty complex questions. They don't just ask, what's the impact of this intervention? Usually what they ask are questions which start with a given problem. They start with, what can we do about ... what can we do about obesity, for example? And they don't just look at what can we do about. They're interested in, well, okay, so we've got one particular approach to intervention, but who might this be most acceptable for? Who might it be appropriate for? We're interested, we might have a particular service. How can we get people to sign up for this service? And so they ask some complicated questions around to what extent and in what ways does the person who delivers this intervention affect the outcomes, for example? Who does it work for and why? And what works to achieve this outcome, for whom, in what circumstances? So we get complex and we get compound questions which don't easily map on to particular research literatures. As I've said, our questions, they start from a given problem, usually a known outcome or a population, and they identify a range of answers. They have multiple components, and what is quite common in a lot of the reviews that we do is that the real question is what causes variation in outcome. It's less around what are we going to get if we do this, because I think people's understanding have advanced to a point now where we don't expect to get a single response, if you like, to a particular intervention. We get a range of outcomes and a range of responses from different people, and what policymakers are interested in is understanding what those causes of variation are. So we do systematic reviews which don't aim to come to a single answer, And what we're really looking to be able to do is explain and understand what is going on in between different interventions, which might start to help people to understand for whom and why a particular intervention has the effect that it does or doesn't have. Finally, one of the challenging areas about doing research for policy is that policymakers seek to blend, as I put on this final bullet point here, they blend the micro with the macro perspective. So we find that we're interested in impacting outcomes at a sort of a population level or a sort of a local population level. But in order to understand and unpick and to identify some of the sort of explanatory issues that I've been talking about, we're needing to blend this macro perspective of influence at a fairly wide population level with the micro perspective of actually what's going on in individual people's lives, which means that they do or they don't respond to a particular intervention strategy. So I've got a little bit more on this, and I've taken this from Julia Brannan's paper, which you can download from the NCRM website. It's well worth a read if you're interested in an introduction to mixed methods research. So we've got these two perspectives, and obviously there is a continuum between the two. But there's a micro perspective where what we're wanting to do is emphasize the agency of those who we're studying. We're wanting to understand their experiences, their interpretations, the meanings that they draw from particular phenomena. And then the macro perspectives, you might sort of think of as large-scale surveys, cohort studies, maybe large trials, which are concerned with looking at patterns across the population and trends, and help in terms of sort of service planning overall and thinking about more structural explanations. And often what we find is that actually we need to do a little bit of both in a lot of the reviews that we do. So we've covered complexity of context and the complexity of the types of questions that are asked. Finally, I've got a quick slide on the complexities that are caused by the data. And this really is summarized up in one slide, which is there are just no replications, or at least there are almost no replications of intervention studies in many areas of social research. And what I mean by that is that whenever someone tries or conducts a trial of a particular intervention strategy, it's very rare that someone else will then come along and then try and do that exact same intervention in a different or a similar context. Usually people will vary the intervention in some way. They'll take that as their starting point and they'll add things or they'll remove things, or they'll just try a completely different strategy altogether. There are very, very few replication studies. There are some, there's no doubt there are a few, but on the whole, the culture is in this area that you don't just replicate what somebody else has done. And sometimes it's actually quite difficult to get funding to do that. People think, well, you know, someone's already tried that. What's the value in trying it again? The problem is, in terms of research synthesis, is that a lot of the methods that we have for synthesis, in terms of statistical meta-analysis, really rely on there being replications. The expectation and the premise behind those methods is that we've got some homogeneity there. We've got similarity of people, of interventions, of outcomes, so that we can aggregate, we can put things together, we can put similar with similar, like with like, and get a greater confidence in what actually the effect of that intervention. The problem in our area is that we don't really know what that intervention is, because what we end up with in a review are multiple examples of similar types of interventions, all of which differ in smaller or larger ways from one another. So to summarize, if you want to go in terms of synthesis, we wouldn't start necessarily from the methods that we've got. What we find is that standard systematic review methods can't cope with some of the complexities that I've identified here. And so we need to use appropriate methods that are able to cope better with complexity, that actually help us to tackle some of those issues around explanation, and operate in what I've called small n scenarios. And what I mean by that is that if we've got, say, 10 studies which are looking at a particular strategy, we might well have 10 studies there, but maybe only 2 or 3 of them are actually comparable enough to think of as being the same intervention. So actually what we've got are multiple examples, small numbers of comparable interventions. So how do we think about how we understand the differences and the similarities in those situations? So it won't be a surprise for you to hear that mixed methods reviews are a potential solution to some of these problems. I'm going to talk a little bit about the mixed methods literature and a little bit about the mixed methods heritage. So mixed methods reviews address complex, compound questions that I've talked about. And what we do with them is we use different types of evidence in what I call a dialectical fashion to grapple with complexity. And I'm going to come back to that, and that'll be one of the examples that I give, so I won't dwell on it now. And what we can also do with these types of reviews is mitigate some of the impact of the lack of replications I was just talking about, helping us to blend this micro and the macro perspective, so helping us to think in terms of the large scale of large data sets, but also think about how individual people's experiences and understandings help us to understand what is going on and understand what's going on in the bigger picture. So some of this thinking's already taken place in the primary mixed methods literature. So there is lots of writing on this, and I've written some. I've given you some references, but I do recommend that paper by Julia Brannan, which I highlighted a few slides ago, as being a good introduction to it. So mixed methods is defined as a type of research where researcher, an investigator, mixes or combines qualitative and quantitative research techniques, methods, approaches, or data, concept, language into one study. So what we're thinking about is looking across the whole of the different types of research evidence that are available, which we can identify, which is about a particular issue, and how we can pull them together to get a sort of a stronger picture of really what is going on. People have talked about mixed methods research as being expansive and creative, being certainly one of the principles about being inclusive and pluralistic, and there's quite a freedom when you're conducting, or at least designing methods that you're going to use in a mixed method study, to be quite creative. There are obviously statistical rules which you'll have come across in the past, but at the same time, when you're designing a mixed method study, it's a creative process where you think about what types of knowledge, what types of evidence might be available, and how you might best be able to put those different pieces of evidence together, still in a robust and a systematic way. So we don't compromise on those sorts of principles. So again, the Julia Brannan paper picks up on why mixed methods fits quite well with evidence-informed policy and practice. It fits quite well in terms of sort of a political currency, as Martin Hammersley's called it, according to practical inquiry. So it's really sort of thinking about solutions to practical problems, while sort of more scientific, maybe disciplinary-based research might require closer attention to and justification for methods used and types of data generated, which is one of the things I'm going to come back to when we think about paradigms. But that kind of demand is relaxed in an inquiry which is aimed at solving a practical problem, because actually what we're wanting to do here is identify the best evidence that we can get to inform a particular decision. And that, of course, is then in line with that slide I showed near at the beginning on evidence-based medicine, which is about the judicious use of current best evidence. It's not really specifying actually what that evidence should be. It's simply thinking about, well, what is the best evidence that we can use? There's obviously some downsides to this, and one of them identified here is that researchers have less leeway to define their own research questions and follow their own ideas. So there are pros and cons to being engaged in this type of activity. There are a number of different reasons why we might combine different sorts of data, different results. I've talked a little bit about the need to explain, the need to elaborate on on a generic finding to understand what situation that, or what context that might apply to. So that's one of the reasons that we use mixed methods literature. Also, an important concept is initiation, where what we're doing here is thinking about how we can take data from one context or one type of literature to drive an analysis, and what I've called here an empirically driven analysis. Again, what happens thereafter is explaining findings. So it's initiating a new analysis based on evidence and based on a perspective which we might have gleaned from a particular literature. I mentioned this issue about making use of all the evidence, which is called complementarity here. And one of the really key issues that we find that mixed methods helps us to deal with is this of contextualization, where what we're doing an awful lot of the time in evidence synthesis is thinking about, okay, so we've got evidence from this context, often from the US, for example. There's an awful lot of research that's carried out in the US. How does that actually apply in other countries, other health systems, other systems? How can we take evidence that's been generated from one situation and use it and apply it to a decision in another? So contextualization and recontextualization is an important use of mixed methods. And the final bullet point here, I think, is a really critical one for mixed methods synthesis as opposed to mixed methods primary research, because it enables us to see the problem from different directions, different perspectives. And I'm going to talk about that right now, in fact. So mixed methods reviews have quite a lot in common with mixed methods in primary research, but the really key difference between the two, I think, is the social nature of research activity. And this guy, Thomas Kuhn, back in the 1960s, first wrote Structure of Scientific Revolutions, where what he did was he highlighted the way in which researchers tend to coalesce around particular areas of shared understanding for their investigation. And what we've got in the background here is a sort of little network graph which shows people all clustered around a similar research topic. But they don't just cluster around a similar research topic. What they do is they cluster around a research topic, but they have a shared understanding about the legitimate ways in which it's legitimate to conduct research around that research topic. And so when you get clustering like that, a shared understanding of what's important, how we should investigate it, and how we should justify our claims. He describes these as being research paradigms. And the next slides, we'll talk about those a little bit more. So a paradigm is really a social construct, which is around thinking about research activity as being conducted by communities of researchers who have a shared understanding around what they're interested in studying, how the concepts they've got within what they're studying are related to one another, and how they should be done, the methods and the tools and the knowledge claims that can be made on the basis of the research that they're conducting. And even within a discipline, what we find is that different methodological approaches then, in terms of qualitative, quantitative, the paradigm split here, can reflect quite different fundamental understandings about what's important and also about ethics around whose voice should be heard. And what we find when we're doing mixed methods research synthesis, as opposed to primary research where the mixed methods all in the same study, is when you're doing a synthesis, what you identify are these clusters, these communities of researchers who have coalesced around particular topics. But because we're looking at research activity as a whole, what we do is we can identify different communities of researchers who are talking and investigating the same issue, but because they've got different perspectives and different priorities in the way in which they investigate whatever it is, we actually have quite different perspectives and different understandings around what's important, how something should be investigated, etc. And so, but they're still looking at the same issue. And this is what I'm going to come back to in the example fairly soon. They're looking at the same issue from different directions. And so this can really give us some quite important insights. And by building up different perspectives and using the different perspectives in opposition to one another almost, to understand what's going on in different situations, we can start to understand and explain why particular research might be finding the findings that it does. And this is much more concrete when I get into the example. So I'm now going to get on to the practical part of this webinar, where I'm going to think about how mixed methods reviews are actually conducted. So Pierre Pluy and Quan Hong have produced this really nice paper, which they're called Combining the Power of Stories and the Power of Numbers. And I recommend it for reading because it's a nice and clear summary of some of the ways in which you might want to think about what we're doing in a mixed methods review. And they say there are 3 overall ways, and many people have said this, so that they wouldn't claim that they were the only ones. But there are 3 overarching ways in which we combine different types of research in a systematic review. We think about the sequence in which we're combining qualitative and quantitative studies, qualitative and quantitative data. Whether we do it sequentially for a start, or whether we do it at the same time. So there's sequential designs and there are convergent designs. And then within those 2 overarching ways of thinking about combining different types of research, there are then different characteristics of the different types of synthesis that you can do there. So one of the main differences within a sequential design is whether what we're wanting to do is seek explanation, we're wanting to explain some of the findings that we're seeing in the research, or we're exploring, so we're opening up the issues. We might be developing like a taxonomy or something like that, where we're rather than saying this is the reason that this is happening, we're wanting to identify a list of understandings or a list of phenomena. And then the convergent designs are those where the qualitative, quantitative data are transformed before synthesis takes place. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through a worked example in a little bit of detail, which is in the sequential explanatory area, and then I'm going to refer you to some other reading for the other types. One of the things that I wanted to talk about in this, and I'm not going to spend a long time on it because I know that Karen's already covered this, is configuration and aggregation. And I think this is important here because it really starts to get at what we're doing in the area of synthesis, what we're doing in the analysis, rather than saying we're doing qualitative or quantitative analyses, which actually, especially the word qualitative, just covers such a vast range of types and approaches and stances to doing research that you really, if someone says they've done a qualitative analysis, it actually is really quite difficult to know what they've done. So what we've been thinking in terms of, and there are other people here, and we've listed some papers for you, is think about actually what are we trying to achieve in the analysis? What's the difference? What's actually going on in the synthesis? So we've got this heuristic of aggregation and configuration. So aggregation refers to adding up, to aggregating, to putting findings from similar research studies together to answer a review question. So if you've come across Cochrane systematic reviews, a meta-analysis is a good example of an aggregation. And what we're wanting to do here is to indicate the direction and the size of effect, so the size of the effect size, and whether it's in a positive or negative direction, and then the degree of confidence that we've got in that finding. So the more studies we have to put in our analysis, we have to aggregate, or the more stones we've got in our cairn here, the more confident we are that that actually is the place that it is. So in a meta-analysis, what you would see is the more studies, so long as we're not violating any of the assumptions underpinning a meta-analysis, what you'll end up with are smaller and smaller confidence intervals around an effect. And in contrast to this, configuration is around arranging research findings, and it's around saying, okay, so we've got this study which tells us about this piece of the picture, then we've got this study here which tells us about these people, for example, we've got these studies here which tell us about this approach to intervention. And what we can do with a configurative type of approach is we can build up a picture of what the researcher is telling us, potentially across quite a wide area of research. And you don't simply get aggregation or configuration in a review. Often you get both. And a lot of the mixed methods reviews that we do, we explicitly have both aggregation and configuration. So as Karen's talked about this, I'm not going to talk about this in any more detail than this, other than to say that one of the sort of the key aspects of doing a configurative review, where we're wanting to understand and build up a picture of research activity and what research is telling us across a wide area, is that sometimes we've got aggregation and configuration going on at the same time. So we might do separate analyses where if you visualize separate piles of paper for interventions which are which have got the same approach in the same context with the same people. And we might have several different piles of paper. So we would aggregate within each pile of paper, and then we would configure between them. So that would start to help us to understand variation between the different study findings. Now I'm going to talk you through the first type of mixed method synthesis, which is what's called a sequential explanatory design. So it's sequenced. We've got a qualitative and a quantitative separate synthesis, followed by what we call a mixed method synthesis, where they come together. And the paper which outlines some of these methods is there at the bottom of the slide. So here's the overall design of the study. This systematic review was around the barriers to and facilitators of fruit and vegetable intake amongst children aged 4 to 10, and that was set by people who were busy at the time developing policy for interventions, partly interventions in schools. And they were interested in the barriers and facilitators of fruit and veg, their healthy eating. So we did what we called a mapping exercise, where we searched quite broadly and we identified a lot of different studies. And we then took that back to the policy team, who said, actually, this is the area we're most interested in. And then we then identified 2 broad areas of research that we were going to look at. We've got what's called the VIEW studies. We had 8 of them. The VIEW studies, what you might think of as qualitative studies, there were focus groups and interviews with children, which were talking to them about their healthy eating, and in this case, they had to have something about fruit and vegetables in them. And then on the left-hand side there, we've got the trials, which are typical evaluation studies, where there was an intervention that was evaluated in a controlled trial, and we had 33 of them. And we did a meta-analysis with them, and then we brought all of the studies together there at the bottom of the screen, the trials and views mixed method synthesis. So that's the structure of the study. We have a qualitative synthesis, we have a meta-analysis, and then we have a mixed method synthesis. I'll take you through the various stages of this now. So first of all, I'm highlighting what the meta-analysis looked like. This is one particular analysis. It's a forest plot, for those of you familiar with forest plots. Each of the rows in the graph is one study. This is for fruit and vegetable intake. And anything to the right of this 0 line, any little red dot to the right, is a positive result, and any little red dot to the left is a negative result. So there's one trial that managed to reduce fruit and vegetable intake amongst the children that it was intervening with. And the little horizontal lines that go through the red line are the confidence intervals. So you can see that, broadly speaking, most of the studies had a positive effect, but there's quite a lot of difference. There's quite a lot of heterogeneity there. And they were all similar studies. Most of them were involving schools and intervening in schools. But beyond saying, well, overall, they seem to be able to promote the consumption of another half a portion or quarter of a portion a day, there's not really very much that we can say about this because they were all quite different. So that was the quantitative, single quantitative synthesis on its own. It tells us that things work overall, but we don't really understand why, because they're all quite different to one another. So now we move to the qualitative synthesis, and I've got the pattern of the mosaic behind here because we're doing a configurative synthesis here. And if you come across other methods, obviously you've been through 2 other presentations on qualitative synthesis, so I won't talk about this at great length. The methods are presented in this paper here that I've cited here. Our source data here with the text of the documents, the material, the concepts, the understandings that were reported by the children. And the real key method about doing this type of synthesis, as I'm sure you've already heard, is around translation. It's around identifying concepts which translate well or translate between different studies to identify those studies where we've got agreement, and sometimes, though it's quite rare, you get disagreement. Usually what happens if you've got disagreement, then you've got an opportunity to start to understand and explore why there might be disagreement between studies. So there were 3 stages really in the synthesis, though they were iterative, and so it looks very clean and neat going 1, 2 and 3 here, but sometimes there's a little bit of iteration between stages 1 and 2 and 2 and 3. So first of all, we treat essentially the documents as data. We treat those primary research study reports as data, and we go through them applying methods of qualitative data analysis that you might well apply to interview transcripts, for example. So we code the text, we develop descriptive themes, and we identify findings. And then once we've been through and identified these findings and we've identified these themes, we analyze the themes, we group the themes so that we end up with really quite a sort of a detailed understanding of how the different concepts in that school of studies relate to one another. And then at that point, then we had quite a nice synthesis, but it didn't directly help us to get the 2 groups of studies to speak to one another. So to do the mixed method synthesis, we then undertook stage 3, which was around generating what we call analytical themes in the light of the review question. So to begin with, we went through all of the different studies. We coded the themes described in our data extraction. One of them was bad food is nice, good food is awful. And we developed descriptive third. We had 36 descriptive codes. And then we grouped them, as I've said, and we developed this synthesis and this summary of 13 descriptive themes, which helped us to understand really what was going on and the relationships between the concepts in those studies. This is a screenshot of what it looked like at the time. So we had the data, which were the primary studies, and we had the codes that we were generating as we went through, and we coded the studies line by line, as I've said. So you might use NVivo or any other package to do that. This is our software peer reviewer. The other thing that we did then was we represented some of the concepts pictorially and diagrams. Helps us to understand the relationships between them. But once we've done that, we had quite a nice synthesis, but it didn't really completely address the review question because it was a synthesis of those studies in their own terms. And what we then needed to do was to do some analytical work to infer what the recommendations, what the implications for interventions are from those studies, and in order to generate the data that we needed to undertake the mixed method synthesis. So it's easier to see that in reality than in abstract here. So we went back to our review questions. What were the children's perceptions of and attitudes to healthy eating? What do they think stops them eating healthily? What do they think helps them eat healthily? And what could be done to promote their healthy eating? And then what we ended up with was a list of recommendations for interventions, which we then reanalyzed and identified really what the themes which underpin them were. So some of the key themes were around children's perceptions and understandings of health and who is responsible for health. So they were very clear that they didn't see it as their role to be interested in their health. That was an adult responsibility. And also that when people would say to them, eat this, it's good for you, that wasn't necessarily very relevant or credible to their lives. You know, the future didn't really exist in quite a real way. And so saying, well, this is not going to be good for you when you're 40, just had no salience for a child aged between 4 and 10. And the implications for interventions then, thinking about what those themes were telling us, was really around, well, okay, so health is clearly a problematic subject. So, but children sort of value taste far more than health in terms of their decision making. So let's talk about food being tasty rather than being healthy. Because as I showed you in that earlier quotation, the kind of the opposite was starting to happen, in that whenever someone said to children, well, eat this, it's good for you, the children were automatically starting to think, well, I'm automatically not going to like it. It's awful. So that was a possibly sort of harmful way of thinking about why a child should eat a particular food. They should eat food because they think they'll enjoy eating them, and they're tasty rather than they're healthy. So equally, the implication for interventions is that the emphasis on health messages should be reduced, and that fruit and vegetables shouldn't be promoted basically in the same way as the same thing in the same intervention. The children were really quite clear that fruit and vegetables had quite different meanings in ways for the children, and they were quite keen on some sorts of fruit but disliked some sorts of vegetables, and so that they saw them as being quite different, and so sort of lumping them all together in the same intervention again didn't seem to be in line with the way that the children saw the world. So we had these findings that were coming out of the qualitative synthesis, which had quite clear messages for interventions. And that was the point of this part of the analysis. We wanted to identify some key features of interventions which, according to the perspectives and the worldview of the children, would be more likely to encourage them to eat healthily than not. So then what we did was we took our recommendations for interventions here in this cross-synthesis matrix, and here are 3 of them on the left here: don't promote fruit and vegetables in the same way, etc. And then we looked across at the quantitative studies, the trials, and looked to see which of those were in line and which were not in line with the findings from the qualitative synthesis. So we've got on the right-hand side here the outcome evaluations, and we separated them into the good quality and the other, so the ones that we wanted to rely on and those that we didn't. So our first message, don't promote fruit and vegetables in the same way, we had absolutely no trials which really took that kind of message on board, or which really based their interventions on that. All of them, where they did have fruit and vegetables in the same intervention, promoted them in the same way. They were all around 5 a day, grab 5, eat 5, it's good for you, etc. So we moved on. We looked at branding fruit and vegetables as exciting or child relevant, and reducing the health emphasis in messages to promote fruit and vegetables, particularly those which concern future health. And here we did find some trials. We had found 5 soundly evaluated in the bottom row and 6 other. So we had some data here. So then what we were able to do was to conduct some statistical subgroup analysis to look to see whether, based on the findings from the qualitative studies, if following the advice, if you like, from the children from this synthesis, we were able to identify and understand differences in the findings of the trials. So did those trials which didn't go on about health being the reason that children should eat this, did they actually do better than those that did? So methodologically, this method of synthesis across the different study types preserves the integrity of the different types of studies. So it doesn't try and get qualitative research to do what qualitative research can't do. It gets it to do what it's really good at. Likewise, it doesn't try and make the trials do things that trials can't do. It keeps the different types of research as methodologically distinct and uses their strengths. It allows us to explore heterogeneity in ways which we might well not have imagined in advance. But it facilitates this analytical explanation. It helps us to understand what's going on in the different types of interventions that we had in the review. But it also protects against data dredging, because it's a theoretically informed framework for exploring differences between studies. But it's not as like a free-for-all. It's not something where we can just go around looking and dredging the data for statistically significant differences. We had some hypotheses that came from the qualitative studies, and those were the hypotheses which were then tested in the interventions and in the subgroup analyses we then conducted. And epistemologically, in terms of thinking about how this helps us to know, if you like, better than we did before, it's helping us to integrate quantitative estimates of benefits and harm with qualitative understanding from people's lives. And what this is really helping us to do is to generate cross-paradigm knowledge. So remember, a few slides ago I was talking about the way in which research is conducted in little clusters of researchers. So many of the trials were either conducted by people from the same institutions, or there were people who were collaborating across institutions, or they cited one another. There's a strong network of people who are investigating this field, and not surprisingly then, the studies have a similar approach, and that's probably one of the reasons why we saw that there were so many similarities between some of the trials in terms of the fact that they didn't they didn't treat fruit and vegetables differently, for example. They had the similar approach there. Likewise, there are people doing qualitative research among children, often not always simply around the promotion of healthy eating, but certainly around children's understandings of their lives and of their own health. And they've got their own way of understanding what's important and how to investigate the world. And those two schools of thought, the trialist school of thought and the research, the sociology of childhood, some of the studies came from that perspective, traditionally they don't tend to talk to one another. And so what we were able to do in this analysis, and we've done it in other analyses since as well, is think about how knowledge coming from these quite different perspectives and different schools of thought can actually be used to generate new understanding. So that's what I mean by this cross-paradigm knowledge being generated here. So in terms of the mixed method synthesis heuristics that I talked about earlier, in the meta-analysis, we aggregated the findings across the studies and thought about them in terms of being a single paradigm. The qualitative synthesis then aggregated within the concepts and then configured between them to help us to build up that picture of recommendations for interventions, mostly within that using a single paradigm stance again. Then finally, the mixed method synthesis aggregated the findings within each recommendation in a single paradigm and then configured findings between them in a dialectical paradigm stance. And that's what I've referred to several times now, this dialectical idea, where we've got research coming from quite different traditions. So we've got the research from the trials, which is literature which has been produced often by people who've been either collaborating with one another from the same institution or between institutions, or following a similar school of thought. So a lot of the papers cite one another, even if they don't have the same authors. And there's a body of research which is around investigation of healthy eating among children. And people go to the same conferences, they cite one another, and there's a school of thought which is developing and evolving in that area. And there's another school of thought which is around investigating the lives of children, not just in terms of their health, but their social lives and other aspects of their lives too. And the two often don't meet. So there are different networks of researchers who are investigating, in this case, what we've identified as overlapping topic, which is children's healthy eating, or children's eating anyway. And by using the different schools of thought, the different research traditions, and the different methods, we were able to generate new, what we've called cross-paradigm knowledge, to help us to start to understand why some of the interventions in our analysis have different results to one another. So there are a couple of references there if you want to follow up either on thematic synthesis or on the mixed methods, synthesis methods. So I'm now just going to take you through the other types of synthesis and mixed method synthesis, and I'm not going to give you detailed worked examples here, but I can refer you to further reading. So first of all, there's another type of sequential synthesis, which is what we've called, or is generally called sequential exploratory design. So rather than trying to explain the differences that we're seeing in our case between the different studies, what it's wanting to do is to generate new hypotheses or knowledge gaps, or, as I said, develop a new typology. So there's one synthesis that I can think of which developed a typology of reasons why people did or did not participate in clinical trials. And there's a reference here which is on pediatric medication error, which we conducted here this year, where we used a mixed methods design to explore differences in trials. And finally, there's this convergent method. And convergent approaches really have to begin by transforming data. So if you've got qualitative data and quantitative data, they need to be transformed in some way in order for them to be comparable and combined at the same time. There's no sequential stage here. Everything goes together in one pool. But either the qualitative data need to be quantitized, or the quantitative data need to be qualitized, if you like, in order for them to be pooled together. So when we're thinking about convergent qualitative designs, now these are where we have quantitative data and qualitative data, and what happens is the quantitative data are transformed into qualitative findings. They're transformed into themes and concepts, configurations, etc., and patterns. And then they're combined on the sort of unequal playing field with qualitative data. One of the most common techniques is thematic synthesis, thematic analysis, and more complex data transformation happens within a realist synthesis, where we're thinking about theory as well. So I refer you here to the Ramesses project, which has got some training materials on realist synthesis. So the opposite of that really is convergent QUAN, where what we're doing is we're going to conduct a quantitative analysis. And so what we need to do here is turn any qualitative findings into numbers, and then we can combine them with the quantitative. And these are fairly rare still in practice, but there's plenty of worked examples around. So some of the typical methods which use a convergent quantitative design are Bayesian syntheses or Bayesian networks, qualitative comparative analysis. Charles Reagan and his set theoretic way of conducting analysis would be an example of that. And I've got some further readings for you there. So there's a methodological paper that we were involved in writing here on qualitative comparative analysis and systematic reviews. And then Gavin Stewart and colleagues have done a paper on the uses of Bayesian networks as tools in research synthesis. And that's an example of a convergent quantitative design. Right, so I feel the last bit's a whistle-stop tour of different options, but I didn't want to overwhelm you with detailed examples. If you're interested in those, then I would start with the Pierre Pluy paper on the power of words and numbers, and then follow up the leads in the areas of mixed method synthesis that you're interested in. What I wanted to take you through here was the way in which mixed methods research synthesis have a dynamic and an evolving heritage. And so it's not fixed and that's part of the excitement and the challenge of working in this area. We're involved in addressing these compound questions in complex areas and blending these micro-macro perspectives, and that's something which I hope came through in the worked example there. So we have the micro perspective of the children's views in the focus groups and the interviews, and then we have the macro perspectives provided by some of them are quite large trials. And then what we did was we blended them in order to start to explain differences in approach within those interventions. And what the mixed method synthesis also did here was really to reflect the state of current knowledge more faithfully than simply focusing on one or the other. And by bringing them together, we overcame some of those gaps that you see caused by some of these paradigm divisions between qualitative and quantitative. And I'd end up with saying, well, these methods are still evolving, and it's a really rewarding and interesting field to work in. So I look forward to your questions.
Well, thank you very much, James, for today's presentation. I also want to thank everyone for participating this afternoon. We hope you found this session to be helpful as it wraps up our current 4-part series on qualitative research synthesis. And here on the last slide is a link to a brief evaluation form, and we would really appreciate your input. We will also be sending an email with the link for the evaluation to everyone who registered. On this final note, I would like to conclude today's webinar with a big thank you to our speaker, Dr. James Thomas, from myself, Ann Williams, and all of the staff at the KTDRR. We appreciate the support from NIDR to carry out the webinars and other activities. We look forward to your participation in future events. Good afternoon.